So the printing press has only been in operation for the past 2.5 hours. That would be true if you crammed all of the last 5,025 years, the entire history of writing, into a 24-hour period. Then the printing press would only have been in operation for like the last 2.5 hours of that 24-hour period. The printing press's arrival coincided with this crazy shift in Western culture where we had the Renaissance and Enlightenment, rationalism, industrialism, and the scientific revolution. All of this coincided together, and the printed word then, in the midst of all of that, became a foundational element of Western thought. It influenced how we understood and shared knowledge, and how we applied our knowledge, and how we shared our knowledge. And most of our understanding of the Bible has been shaped within a modern Western context, a culture saturated with text. And that has greatly influenced, maybe limited, our interpretations of the Bible. It's so important to remember that for most of human history, maybe even for most cultures around the world today, in the majority world, access to the text is much more limited than our own cultural realities. Most of humanity has not read their definitive stories and traditions. They've heard them and seen them performed. So what follows here, what I'm doing here, is I'm trying to put together a 10-minute crash course on what we know about how communication in oral traditional cultures actually works, so we can have some context for other videos that I have on the channel here. Especially the interviews that I'm going to be conducting with scholars in the fields of orality and textuality, media studies, biblical performance, criticism, and all that. So yeah, buckle up. All right, a little historical insight. Up until the 1960s, and really even still today, many biblical scholars have operated under assumptions about oral traditions that were more reflective of our understanding of them through our Western text-saturated post-Enlightenment cultural biases. Scholars like Hermann Gunkel and Rudolf Bultmann launched this area of biblical criticism called form criticism. And what they pictured was this naive, disconnected tradition of oral forms that would be used in communities for specific points. And the texts that we have, the traditions that we have in the biblical text, don't represent the original structure of the traditions, but editors took the old traditions, the oral forms, and pieced them together into more solidified wholes. But if we go to the text, we can mine from the text these older oral forms. This approach often greatly misunderstands the flexibility, adaptability, and the holistic tendencies of conservation of oral traditions. And all too often, when the word orality is spoken among biblical scholars, paradigms of form criticism are assumed. But the exploration of theories of orality has evolved significantly over the past 100 years, and biblical criticism has been slow to keep up with the field. Perhaps the most notable paradigm shift that occurred in the field of orality was in the 1960s due to Milman Parry and Albert Lord's analysis of these oral traditions in Serbo-Croatia, and they applied theories from their study of those oral traditions to their study of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And they demonstrated connections in the oral formulaic structures in these epics, and they suggested that their theories might be applicable to other oral traditional texts, maybe perhaps like the Bible. However, their approach supported a perspective to oral traditions that saw a great divide between orality and literacy. And this theory was later promoted further by scholars like Walter Ong and Jack Goody. It suggested a sharp cognitive and cultural shift from oral to literate societies. So this great divide theory posited that literacy fundamentally changed cultural dynamics because the written word had the power to transform the culture away from its oral traditional roots. And this approach overlooked the continuity between oral and written performances and the continuity within the culture that utilized written forms of their traditions. So then John Miles Foley marked another significant turn in the field by challenging these rigid distinctions between orality and literacy. He emphasized the ongoing interaction between oral and written forms within real oral cultures, advocating for an approach that recognized the fluidity and interdependence between these media, these modes of communication. So Foley's work led to a broader understanding that both oral and written media are part of the same traditional approach to specific cultures, rather than being opposing categories. Building on Foley's theories, scholars like Susan Neidich applied these insights to biblical texts, identifying features such as repetition, formulaic language, and metonymy that were indicative of oral tradition. And so many scholars now prefer terms such as media studies over terms like orality or oral tradition. And scholars like David Carr and Raymond F. Person Jr. have explored how texts functioned as memory aids within oral cultures, and how a performance of a smaller part of the tradition can activate or stand in the place of a larger part of the tradition, or even as the epic as a whole, and how different performances of the same traditional material can simultaneously and accurately represent the tradition without either variation being designated as more original or more accurate. Variation in detail does not mean that the tradition has been changed or misrepresented. Sometimes different performances of the same traditional material done differently are accepted as accurate and equally original. So this ongoing evolution in scholarship reflects a broader shift towards appreciating the intricate ways in which oral traditions and textuality interweave, offering richer interpretations of ancient texts, including our Holy Scriptures. So, how about a quick summary of current theories and conversations around oral traditions, written text, biblical interpretation, what we might call media criticism? As we look at these theories, keep in mind the context of the kind of traditional cultures that we're actually talking about. These are communities in which the vast majority, almost everyone in the community, never would really read any of their traditional material. They would hear it performed. They would experience a performance of this material. And they'd heard these traditions. They'd experienced performances of these traditions since before they were even born. They heard these stories in the womb. And these traditions weren't just packets of data to know intellectually. These traditions had shaped and formed a communal identity deep within the psyche of every single individual. So these stories, these traditions were who they were. These traditions were not passed down through some mechanism like the old telephone game where a random sentence is slowly distorted through each telling. In this cultural reality, everybody already knows the traditions, and the performer, usually some kind of official tradition carrier like a priest or a bard, can perform the familiar traditions in creative ways to help activate the communal identity of the people that's already there in their current cultural situation. And so there's often a special and expected set of words and phrases and formulas and scenes that the whole culture already understands and knows. They expect to hear their stories told in these words, through these scenes, in these phrases, with these formulas. And the performer uses these key pieces of the community's extended tradition to tell a specific part about their extended tradition. And they expect the community to know what he or she, the performer, actually means, because everything is already shared in this greater, what some people call biosphere, circumambient tradition, this all-consuming tradition of the culture's cultural identity. A great example is if you were ever raised in the church or spent much time in the church, if I told you the Lord is my shepherd, most Christians will know that what I really mean by those words is something like, God will help you in this difficult time. With only a few traditional words, I can convey an entire aspect of our tradition that relates to the faithfulness of God, to His goodness, His ability and promise to protect and love His people. And even when people would write traditions down in these oral traditional cultures, they didn't just stop telling them aloud. Written documents weren't usually only for reading quietly, they were normally used as memory aids, helping storytellers remember the tales accurately during public performances. The way the stories were told, with repetition and memorable phrases and the rhythmic style, influenced how they were written down because they were written down for the purpose of being performed out loud. This means that even the written Bible has traces of its oral past. Oral traditions are flexible. Storytellers could change small details to make the story more relevant to their current audience or emphasize different lessons. A storyteller didn't need to recount an entire epic each time. Just mentioning a key phrase or even mentioning a character's name could remind listeners of the entire story. This is super important to remember when we look at how the Bible references itself. Even a small word could connect the current performance to an entirely other section of the greater tradition for rhetorical purposes. Performances weren't just entertainment. They were a way for communities to remember who they really were, what they believed in. Everyone knew these stories, and so even small reminders could activate and bring the whole tradition to mind. So scholars today are interested in how this dynamic between speaking and writing helps us understand ancient text better. We're examining different texts not just as errors or changes in the tradition, but as clues to how these stories were told and retold differently over time. Variation in form doesn't suggest for the traditional community that a mistake has been made. Some level of fluidity was just considered normal. And this, of course, has huge implications for things like textual criticism. Realizing that the Bible came from a culture like what we're discussing here allows us to read it with fresh eyes. It's not, and maybe fresh ears. It's not just a book, but a collection of living words that have moved and inspired communities through both hearing and reading. God didn't just preserve his word to us through individual authors or collectors who wrote down specific and necessary holy words. The triune relational God of creation stored his holy word in his community. The Bible is not simply a text to be studied. It's a tradition of identity that is to be reproclaimed and reenacted in the community of faith.